It is my great pleasure to interview, once again, Dr. Ronald Kohanski, Director of the Division of Aging Biology at the National Institute on Aging of the NIH, co-founder of the Trans-NIH Geoscience Interest Group, and great friend of Lifespan.io. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you very much, Keith. It's a pleasure to be here. Good to see you again.
It's a pleasure to have you. And now, it's been a few years since our last interview, I believe, and while we still find ourselves in an era of COVID-19 and various challenges, I'm excited to learn what this period of time has hopefully catalyzed in terms of accelerating progress in fighting age-related disease. Can you start out by describing how you are doing in this time and broadly how these past few years have affected the mood and operations at the NIA?
Thanks for asking. I'm doing pretty well, and I hope you are too. I've managed to avoid contracting COVID, but that's, even though I've gone to a couple of meetings now, wearing masks and trying to take precautions that are advised by CDC, et cetera. It's worked out pretty well. The mood at the NIA is upbeat. Every year, Congress awards us a bit more money for research in Alzheimer's disease. Mm-hmm. And by a bit, I mean a couple $100 million, a few $100 million. And the general budget for NIA, things not Alzheimer's disease, increases as well, as it does across the NIH. There was some money that was specifically designated for work against the COVID-19 pandemic, which was largely in the auspices of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which is the logical place for it. Some of the interest in that was for my institute, was on how older people were more susceptible to the disease. I guess I'm in that age bracket now, so I have to say how we would suffer a bit more of the long-term consequences of that were we to survive, and many of us do. We supported a lot of research trying to leverage some of the knowledge from Geoscience to help with the COVID-19 pandemic, how people might respond to infections. For example, we know that some things like rapamycin and rapalogs, derivatives of it, might be useful in battling the disease in older people, possibly in people who are not so old. And some work testing that was attempted. Also, some work on senolytics, drugs that kill senescent cells. And that's thought that might have aided in reducing the severity of disease and minimizing the consequences of that. All that work is ongoing. So we're hopeful that Geoscience will provide some base of knowledge and some opportunities in the clinic that would help in infections like this. And it's a guess. This is not the last pandemic.
Well, yeah. Looks like we might have another one on the way with the monkeypox, but hopefully not. But I am, optimistic that there will be some positive results there. And I think, obviously it's very tragic that we're having to go through this at all. But I am optimistic that probably nothing can make the point better of the benefits of mitigating, age-related decline than mitigating pandemics like this, at least in terms of public perception. It's easy to not perceive the slow march of aging as an assault on you, but everyone perceives a pandemic as an assault on you and they want to fight against it, right? So I think that could be hopefully a powerful narrative advantage if things go well. On the subject of funding, looking through the NIA fiscal year 2023 budget, it looks like the allocations for aging biology have increased by 1.8% from 2021 to 23, but as compared to approximately 3.2% increase in the NIA budget overall, with both of these percentages being a bit less than inflation throughout the time period. So my question to you is that a sign that there's been less of a priority placed on the core mechanism of the aging than we'd hope? Or have there been under the hood shifts in larger division allocations like neuroscience that actually favor aging biology, but we don't kind of see from that itemization of the budget?
What our mission, of course, is to make do with what we're given and to try to distribute it according to the rules of peer review and the application of the board process. So we're pretty confident that with whatever budgets were given by Congress that the president signs, we'll be able to advance at a reasonable pace the research on biology of aging and all the aspects of aging, from the basic biology all the way through social determinants of health.
Especially with COVID, and the long haulers having, potential cognitive difficulties, right? Does that kind of bleed the lines at all between the neuroscience division and the aging biology division? And have there been kind of stronger official cross collaborations there, or like, what does that even look like in terms of what's in what purview?
Most of the cognitive work is being done by two divisions within National Institute on Aging, the Division of Neuroscience and the Division of Behavioral and Social Research. Cognition is also a behavior, if you will, and it's influenced by stresses to which we're exposed. One of the prominent stresses, of course, being discrimination or chronic discrimination, but there are other factors such as polluted environments, burdens of disease, expectations, feeling of well-being. All those figure into the Division of Behavioral and Social Research mandate. And then on the basic biology side, that's more in the Division of Neuroscience. So our interactions there as to how the brain ages, our contributions are from the periphery, outside the central nervous system. How does aging in the body play out in aging in the brain? Because everything is connected. So we're looking at how the organs interact with each other, both at the organ level, the tissue level, the cells. We had a program some years back about cell-cell communication, what's called cell non-autonomous aging. And that's risen to prominence. There was a recent meeting by EMBO in Europe on interorgan communication. A lot of that featured how aging in the body affects aging in the brain. So we work on that. We collaborate on that where we have the opportunities.
Now, on that subject of health disparities associated with various factors, obviously, in addition to understanding and redressing these disparities, if we can, has anything immediately actionable arisen from that work, both in terms of what people in those special populations can do to mitigate the ill effects of aging, and also in terms of how we as advocates can use those connection points to bring in more allies into our field?
So that's a very difficult question. From the biology side of things, it's difficult because race is not a biological feature. Skin color, eye color, these are things that just come about by various combinations of things. But we're all humans, whatever the color of our skin, or the color of our eyes, or our height, or our weight. So from my division's point of view, we're developing a perspective on health disparities to start with the view of not what's separating us initially, but what unifies us. Where do we have the same features? So if there were a broadly accepted metric of health, and there are some that are reasonably good, if we take that as a starting point, for people of any age, any ethnicity, any geographical location, any other features, you can have people that are disparate in those respects, but have common health aspects or metrics. And then as time progresses for these people, for us, our health status diverges. And that would be a biological question. What is diverging? And then what are the causes of that divergence? So the cancer field, what's necessary and sufficient to produce tumor, those are the hallmarks of cancer. The question in aging that's in flux are the hallmarks of aging as defined by Lopez-Otin and colleagues in 2013, or the pillars of aging by Brian Kennedy. Are those necessary and sufficient to give you the losses of function and losses of plasticity and deficit accumulation that occur with age? The social determinants of health is an entirely different question. Up to the point where how do the social determinants get translated into physiological outcomes? And the thing between the social determinants and the physiology or medicine would be the biology. So the question that's being asked across the NIH is how do you translate, how do you move from social determinants of health to the biology and then to the clinical or medical outcomes? So a lot of this is, what does biology have to offer in terms of measuring health at a molecular level? Which is a little bit difficult to do because you can have the same molecular features from different inputs. So if you have a stressor that's social, as in discrimination, do you get the same outcome from a stressor as in bad diet? Not that that's unlinked to discrimination or where you live, but you can be wealthy and have a bad diet. But should be so lucky. So on the first part, not the second. So we're trying to pull together how the social determinants of health and the biological metrics may be linked to each other. So for example, we know from research supported by NIA, the Division of Behavioral and Social Research, educational attainment has an impact on the trajectory of your health over the life course. How do you measure that, and where do you measure that if you wanted to do that molecularly? What would be in the bloodstream that would reflect educational attainment? And would it be there when you're 50 if your educational attainment stopped when you were 15, for example, or continued until you were 30? These are very difficult questions to address, but you can do them systematically. And so if you look at the Dunedin study, which is Terry Moffat, and Daniel Belsky has some great work on this, Sean Cosby and others. So if you take people in this longitudinal study, which is a birth cohort, there's a wide distribution of health. So you can use those differences at the extremes to kind of calibrate what your health metrics would look like. And they've done that with their pace of aging metrics.
Right.
That's the kind of thing that's very helpful. You get some molecular, you get some clinical, some performance, put them together, and you can get some idea of how a person is doing in terms of age. There's also work from Mike Snyder's lab, the UCSF, on agiotypes, which is, again, a mixture of clinical and metabolic metrics, if you will. And he has short-term trajectories for people. And what you basically find from this is everybody ages differently. Makes it a challenging thing to do, both on the individual level for personalized and precision medicine, and also on the population level. But we are working on it.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I have a twofold question. Number one, based on what you were just saying, is there anything coming out already from the NIH in terms of kind of like a report that sort of makes these corollaries that would then paint the targets for groups like the AFRLI that are lobbying Congress to say, hey, there's this disparity and doing this, it will help in that community, et cetera, like to understand those connects, those causalities that you're saying right there. I have a second follow-up question about biomarkers, but I'll pause on that one.
Sure. Well, to work backwards, yeah. Anybody who's doing policy in capital letters in Congress, for example, you're welcome to read whatever reports they want. But we, as federal employees, don't, in the executive branch, we don't lobby Congress. But we do support the work that they're welcome to make use of. And there would be also some National Academy of Sciences reports on health disparities and a range of topics that are covered by the NIA.
Like, I'm going to say something totally stupid and fantastical, but kind of like winnow it down, right? Like, it would be interesting and weird if, you know, poor education affected the age rate on the Horvath clock more than the other biomarkers. Like, for some reason, education is tied to epigenetic age, something more specific like that, you know?
Right. So actually, Eileen Crimmins and company did attempted to look at educational status versus the clocks of various sorts of clocks. Doesn't necessarily line up that well, which goes back to the question, should it line up that well?
Right.
On the other hand, the same group, or at least Crimmins and colleagues, looked at T-cell distribution, how the some social determinants of health, there's different classes of stressors, like lifelong stressors, short-term stressors, et cetera, how those might affect the distribution of T-cell populations in older people. And there's a correlation that can be made there because different populations will allow you to infer different abilities to, let's say, respond positively to a vaccine by making antibodies, or how you're likely to do against an infectious disease if you were to get it. So there's progress being made in those areas. But ultimately, the proof is, can you change it? But there's also a context for that because we tend to take a self-centered view of the world. I think that's not unusual. We think of education in terms of the US standard, or maybe the standard in some of the European countries, but that's not the standard everywhere. I mean, do you need tensor calculus? Do you need projective geometry to do this stuff? Or can you, basic arithmetic is good enough. So again, educational attainment is always context dependent. There are health and retirement studies all over the world supported by DBSR and other countries' science support systems. And those are informative about cultural differences, cultural similarities, levels of stressors, kinds of stressors, et cetera. So in terms of what's coming out now, I would say that the attempts to link the social to the biological to the clinical, these are all beginning to coalesce.
Great. Now, as a follow-up question to that, so let's say there was a correlation. In order for the end user, the regular person to make use of that, they would need to kind of know where they are. And the average citizen is not going to be doing the Horvath clock for themselves on the regular, right? So a question that I have for you that I'm genuinely curious about is there any existing work now that's trying to, in a sense, create relationships between deeper tests like a Horvath clock and something that could be superficially done, like voice or sound, something that could more easily be readily available to a regular person to kind of get a poor man's proxy version of the Dunite and Pace study for themselves and see whether they're being affected by their disparity, et cetera?
So I don't think there's anything at the moment, but there is an interest across all of NIH in wearables or usables like your cell phones, where you can gather information and there would be ways of interpreting it. But one of the difficulties would be that there's always an error range or confidence interval, if you will, and where do you fall within that? So I think that for a lot of these things, it's going to be how are you doing from one time period to the next? And then the question would be how long a time period do you need to assess changes in health in a reliable way? Or preferably how short a time period would be. So there are all kinds of potential diagnostics and how you or your physician would use those diagnostics is something that we're really very interested in doing. So with the National Institute of Bioimaging and Bioengineering, we're setting up a workshop on a topic called synthetic biology, which would have to do with how can you engineer reporters of aging or reporters of health into cellular systems. But we also have some interest out there in terms of using computer systems, artificial intelligence, and machine learning to be able to better interpret wearable devices. So I think that would get to the issue that you're raising, which is what's out there for everybody, as opposed to what's out there for the high-end, high-priced professional. The other thing is, I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, but I think generally speaking, we tend to lie to ourselves, especially about our health. So, it's good to have somebody who's a bit more dispassionate, and if you have to pay them to be dispassionate, so be it. But that then gets to the question of who has access.
Yeah, that you segued perfectly to another question that I have on my list here, which is basically about things like machine learning, blockchain technology, decentralized science, DeSci, of which a lot of the speakers at the conference here are going to be talking about. So just to give you an example, Ron, you know that I have worked in the past in terms of like audio biomarkers, detection of disease, that sort of thing, right? So it's clear to me that it would be very technologically possible, there's maybe privacy issues, of having a system where someone could just sit down at their laptop and every day just say, how you doing, computer? I'm feeling great, or whatever, and longitudinally collecting that data, which would be able to create very good warning systems for, hey, it sounds like you have COVID. From my view as a technologist, these sort of systems could very easily exist. And the question is more, does the NIA have any specific funding opportunities at that intersection, particular programs by which a large tech company could work with the NIA, that sort of thing?
Well, we don't have anything that's, to my knowledge at the moment, that's specific to that. But we do have the general program, which is the Small Business Research Program, the SBIR, and the Technology STTR. But at any point in time, anybody could make an application on something that they feel is worthwhile, investigator-initiated applications. But in listening to what you're saying, it seems to me that there are several features that could be tracked over time. And using things such as facial recognition that is on your computer, presumably you'd be in control of it, where you can see changes in different things, because the subcutaneous fat and things like that change with age and wrinkles. But there are other features as well. So you mentioned voice. So how a person's voice changes over time. Of course, there'll be some influence of, did you get some sleep last night? Are you on your 12th cup of coffee? That kind of thing that might influence the tone. But if it's averaged over a period of time, you can generally tell So there's also things like your computer could give you some random dots and you're going to follow them. So your visual acuity is going to report brain function. So there are things that you can probably do in the comfort of your home that would be informative. But again, informative is not necessarily actionable information. So it'd be the kind of thing where you'd like to have some standards. I mean, it could tell you something as simple as you need to change your prescription for your eyes, but you don't want to get panicked into thinking, I'm not following all those dots, I've got a brain tumor.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. But yeah, I guess I'm seeing, and again, I know there's a lot of people at the conference here today at various, decentralized autonomous organizations, and I really see a lot of potential capability here if there's a way to hook those systems in to systems that are, validating that the data is normalized and this and that, and be able to then push back kind of aggregate learnings. And, obviously privacy has to be managed and there's details here, but like, I don't know where the decisions come from, but I would strongly love to put some energy in there that like there should be some sort of, decentralized science subdivision of the NIA or the NIH that's hooking in with this stuff.
You might see something like that out of ARPA-H, I think. Which seems to be, it's becoming a reality. They just advertised for a budget officer. So if they're getting closer to the, how to distribute the money, that could be useful. One of the things though that comes to mind is with the 23andMe company, their accuracy increased as they got a larger pool. And I think that's often the case, that as you expand your data pool, the accuracy of individual measurements as pertaining to the individual might increase. So that's something definitely to consider.
Yeah, without going into details, that's where, synthetic data and federated learning and things like that come into play, where you're sort of contributing to this system that's updating your local model, getting better and better over time, where you're only sharing a limited amount of like your actual like PII so you can feel safe and comfortable.
Right. So you make a digital twin. And the digital twin could be accessible, but you are hidden behind the curtain.
Yeah. So now 2 questions following up from that is, opposed to what I'm doing right now, like, is there any sort of official recommendation channel? Like, I know, like, when SOPA and people were going on for the internet, there was like a congressional or a government agency, like suggestion box, like we're opening for comments and everyone, you come in here. Is there anything like that in the NIH or the NIA where like these suggestions that I'm making, where people who are saying, hey, get on decentralized science, how do we express that intent or desire to the NIH or the NIA? Is there an official way of doing that?
Well, there are 2 official ways. There's an unofficial way and an official way. The unofficial way is, write to us. But, you have to pick the right level of entry point. The other thing is the requests for information that sometimes come out from any federal agency where an idea is being floated. They're generated by federal employees, but in response to a perceived need in the research community. We're a funding agency, so our path is pretty well narrowed. The thing that I think is the novelty is the attempt to do a DARPA for health. See how that goes.
What is the latest on that? And I know that there's also been kind of other like House appropriation bills that have been put forth to try to expand funding for the NIA, especially the Division of Aging Biology. So number 1 question is, what's the latest? And number 2, besides getting educated, is there anything that our community can do to kind of help add pressure in the right places, et cetera?
I don't know how much trouble I get in for answering that. As citizens, you are welcome to contact members of Congress or anybody else. Contact Sarah's, HHS, but I can't advise you to do that. But I would be interested in reading some of those letters. I know that William Kennedy Smith put together a group to talk about geoscience and an attempt to see what could be done in terms of greater recognition for the topic.
Is there anything that you feel like our community here at this conference would benefit from knowing that we haven't talked about?
I think that there are a couple of things. If I were looking at a company, I would be asking how they go about identifying targets for intervention. In silico is a great example of that. Fortnoy's BioAge, is it? That's another good example. She's given some really outstanding talks about how they go about their selection process, of course, without revealing what the drugs and targets actually are, which is quite a good trick. I think that looking for solicitations from our SBIR program that Todd Haim runs would be a good idea. They're going to be in the NIH guide at any particular point. There's at least one program currently to develop education in geoscience, which is focused on medical providers. There are efforts to engage with advocacy groups. We did that at the third Geoscience Summit. A workshop coming up on what would be good animals for geoscience. You found it in mice. How do you know it's going to be of any utility in humans? Well, of course, you know because you try, but would there perhaps be other animals that might be useful? We generally tend to think of utility for questions of human health in terms of what mammal could we use. But I think Hugo Bellin in Baylor has a program that uses two kinds of invertebrates and zebrafish to look at rare diseases in humans. And they probably have a lot of success in identifying targets because when you get down to the cellular level, there's going to be a lot of similarity, one cell to another, irrespective of the species. Of course, that's not everything is the same. And also we've relied on genes having similar coding sequences, implying similar functions. But even though most of the gene sequence is the same, all you need are 4 or 5 amino acids to switch the function.
Right.
Because you change the binding partners.
That makes complete sense. Is there anything new at the conversation of, proxy clinical endpoints for aging that can create more avenues for funding to actually work on aging, like what the TAME trial was initially in the dialogue with the FDA? Are there updates to kind of that conversation?
Well, I think it's still pretty much in the same realm. There are a lot of trials that are using drugs. We support, NIH is supporting, where there are single endpoints that are age-related endpoints. And so one concept is if you get enough of these single endpoints for the same drug, you can then state that this is an anti-aging therapeutic. Issues with the kind of thing that's raised in the TAME trial, which in crude terms is start with people with N chronic conditions or diseases and ask how long does it take to get to N+1, whatever N are, whatever N+1 is. And if you give an anti-aging therapeutic, the time window will be lengthened to get to the additional morbidity, because multimorbidity is a big problem in old people, and it's one of the major concerns for geoscience. From my own point of view, I think it would be a good idea to see the trial happen, but to my knowledge, it hasn't happened yet.
Right. No, that makes sense. And I believe that there's a lot of different sort of coalitions that are building around trying to support TAME getting funded. So hopefully that'll be happening at some point.
If they've applied to the NIH, I couldn't even tell you.
And
I don't know. I'm not allowed to say.
And based on what you just said there, yeah, I would love to, over time, I would love to see some comprehensive, combination suite of physiological biomarkers enter that conversation, because not only physical is what people think of, can you actually do things, right? So it's very relevant. And also I feel like that's intelligible for the public. That's the biomarkers that they actually care about. Can I walk? Can I run? Can I do push-ups or get up from sitting in a cross-like position, et cetera? So that's what.
Right. It's what we're interested in doing is getting through the day. We're interested in getting through the day tomorrow as well as we do right now.
Absolutely. And I do like the idea, though, of sort of that looking at the time delta of decline and trying to using that itself as sort of an aggregate marker, which is.
So there's an interesting viewpoint from groups in Canada, Rockwood, and the late Mitnitsky and Susan Hallett, and they have deficit accumulation index, which is a very interesting thing. Susan gave a seminar here a couple months back. The Geoscience Interest Group has seminars once a month. Right now that we're covering resilience and various features of resilience and deficit accumulation. So they've come up with a deficit accumulation that if you have at least 30 deficits, it no longer matters which 30 you've brought into the question. And it doesn't seem to matter if one is a big effect deficit or a small effect deficit. But it's an index that goes from about 0 to 0.6 or 0.7. as opposed to after 0.7, you're just not going to survive because it just can't function anymore. As we were talking about before, can you get through the day? That's one way of looking at aging. So I was just looking at your interview with Vadim Gladyshev, who's, I think Vadim is pushing the envelopes on many fronts. Biology of aging is fortunate to have somebody of his intellectual abilities. So, and actually at the meeting some years ago where Vadim and I were both present, he presented on these signatures of aging that I got very enthusiastic about. In brief, it's, you don't need to know every detail of it, but you need to recognize it's linked to aging, the same as a signature on a document. So you can't read all the letters, but you know it is associated with the person. Yeah, so Vadim raises the question, do we know what aging is? Can we say what it is? If you say it's functional decline, you have to say what you mean by function. If it's molecular, you have to be able to link the molecules to the outcomes. One point of departure I have on that is the emphasis on damage accumulation, which has been in the field for a long time. So in listening to Howlett give her presentation, the deficit accumulation looks like it's a pretty good concept, where the consequences of deficits are greater susceptibility to diseases, greater appearance of diseases, lower resilience, et cetera. So what happens during development is you acquire capacity, and what happens during aging is you're losing capacity. So maybe one view is that there are, over a period of time, there are deficits that are accumulating, and at some point they appear to overcome the robustness of the system. And there you have aging, but not everything is aging. And this is one of the things that I found fascinating in your interview with Vadim. Do we know when aging begins? And I did a set of 3 sessions some years back asking the question, when does aging begin? And I can say definitively, I don't know. And I can also say definitively, I don't think anybody else knows either. But it's an important question, because if you say that aging begins during development, do you interfere with aging during development? That's a problem, because trying to control development, which is highly variable, is problematic in my view.
Given what you were just talking about in terms of deficit accumulation as a marker of whatever we want to call it, aging, right, age-related decline, etc., what are the current roadblocks, and this might touch the TAME question as well, for someone being able to propose a clinical trial for an intervention where the endpoint is slowing that down and for aging? Can that be done right now, or does some bureaucratic boxes still need to get figured out for that kind of trial to happen?
I don't think it's a bureaucratic box. I think the problem is the feature of a deficit accumulation index is that it's robust once you've made 30 measurements. Clinically, the problem is making 30 measurements. You're not going to make 30 measurements in a 15-minute session with your physician. One of the questions for the artificial intelligence world would be, can you get a smaller number that reports the 30 deficits?
Can you give me an example of a couple of these deficits, just so I have a frame of reference here?
Mental acuity, visual acuity, vision, hearing loss.
Okay. Thank you.
Walking speed, gait features.
This is very interesting. Hopefully we'll have something to circle back on in future years, Ron, because I believe that there are systems out there that could create a kiosk that could live in a clinical trial center where someone just walks through it and gets a bunch of these at once. So I'll circle back with you on that, but thank you.
Okay, good.
Thank you for that.
I mean, it's the things about gait and balance are probably really important, and there are lots of tools out there for it. It's just that at the moment, it's not that simple. I would point to one thing. Daniel Promislow at the University of Washington, Seattle, does gait metrics for Drosophila, and unlike us, they have 6 legs.
Trying to remember, is that how many legs that Odin's horse Sleipnir had in mythology? I'm trying to remember if it was 6 or
I can't recall. I was never big on Norse mythology.
Now I want to see a Dali image of Odin riding a Daphne or something like that.
Yeah, we'll work on that one.
Okay, no, very, very fascinating. So I'm gonna noodle on that one some more, but I think I just have one more question for you that's a little bit more philosophical, and I probably know what your answer is going to be, but in certain sectors there's a debate of do we want to classify aging as a disease or not, or does that provoke ageism, etc.? Is that a code that was added to the ICD? It seemed like it was unequivocally a good thing. Do we want more of that, or is it not necessary? There's kind of a lot of debate in the field of like, should we keep pushing on that aging is a disease? In light of what we were just talking about with accumulated deficits, is there any utility to having that conversation in terms of opening up funding, et cetera? Or is it obviated by the fact that if we come up with some kind of reasonable proxy for whatever we want to call it?
Okay.
Yeah.
It's complicated, but let me just give a couple of parameters for it. If aging begins at conception and aging is a disease, what is the implication of that? If aging begins at birth, just to move it forward a little bit, or from Vadim's point when you got to think, Vadim's my favorite scientist, from when the organogenesis is a common feature for vertebrates. If it begins then, but it's still in utero, what does that mean? It may or may not be recognized that only 60% of conceptions for mammals on average results in a live birth. So it's complicated if you identify it as a disease, because you have to ask, what does that mean in terms of practice? Then there's the emotional side of it. We're all doomed to be diseased. Maybe that's not the best viewpoint. It might be accurate, but it might not be the best for our state of mind. On the other hand, you'd also have to ask if a person is robust, no heart disease, no cognitive loss, none of these other things, no, any of that stuff. But they're 75 years old. They're not functioning the way they did when they were 35, guaranteed. Are they diseased because their function has declined? Those are, of course, rare people. What's the implication if you say yes, and what's the implication if you say no?
It's a homework for the listener of what are the implications and what we want to do.
Exactly, yeah.
Diplomatic as always, Ron, but a good one.
I'm learning.
Well, I mean, with that, one last thing. You had mentioned that you wanted everyone to know about a conference that's coming up. So I want to make sure.
Yes, so there's two conferences. One is in October on animals for geoscience, which is the idea of if you have a finding in biology and you want of aging, you wanted to try to apply it, what would be the animal that's not a human that you would look to see if it's going to be likely to be effective in humans? Mm-hmm. Lots of options for that. And then there's the Geoscience Summit, number 4, which is coming up April 24 through 26, 2023. The first time I announced it, I got the dates and the year wrong. I had it in the past. So
anyway, 24, 26.
Yeah, it's like 23, 24. There you go. Brilliant. So this is a meeting that will be 3 days. It'll be in 8 sessions. It'll start with health disparities right at the top. NIH has a mandate to address topics of health disparities in a way that would be helpful to everyone in the country and hopefully everyone in the world. Health disparities are an unfortunate fact of our existence. Some of them we can influence and some of them may keep recurring, but at least we'd like to know what to do. There are human populations that have been studied very well for aging characteristics. What have we learned and how have we learned those things? And then how can we apply that in the context of answering questions about health disparities? Again, from a biological point of view, because biology of aging is at the root of geoscience. And then the question of multimorbidities will be raised because that is a major feature in geriatric populations. So there are 2 things there. There's geriatric syndromes, which are a collection of things that are actually not diseases, but are prevalent in older people. Then we go to questions about metrics for health. Then the next question is on machine learning and artificial intelligence. How do you model aging? And there's a lot of work that's being done on this. And people who have been in the computer science world, such as yourself, have taken an interest in this. How do you go about doing it? Which then leads into biomarkers, because you have input and output variables, and somewhere in there, maybe at both ends, you have biomarkers of aging. That then leads to the question of, you need those for clinical trials. What goes into doing a clinical trial for an anti-aging therapeutic? And then that then leads into the question of, how do you practice this? How do you practice geoscience to benefit people in the community. And that just comes full circle to the question of health disparities.
By the way, that event in Bethesda is a hybrid event. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
So everybody knows. And yeah, I'm very fascinated by the future direction of biomarkers because, just from my vantage point, being involved in computer science or just, even pop culture, right? Video games, etc. Like, again, privacy issues notwithstanding, got to be figured out. But, you could think of any video game, right? If you're a video game designer, right, you might want to gather the data of what the decision-making speed of the players are on a menu because you're trying to optimize that. You're trying to get them to have a smoother experience. But you're actually collecting cognitive biomarker. And I feel like right now there's so much data that's out there, but it's not being cross-referenced in a useful way. And again, there's a Black Mirror version of that future that we have to be careful of, that we protect against with privacy preserving permission. But yeah, I really see that we're very close to machine learning, augmenting biomarkers to really allowing us to hopefully get some very actionable insights to regular people. So we'll see if we get there.
So there's just one last thing on that, because my wife and I play some board games with our 20-something-year-old children, and also with our 5- and 6-year-old grandchildren. And you can tell a difference in processing speed. Now, my wife and I are not that far apart in age, but we are that far apart in processing speed. I am the slowest person ever. So that's just the question of, do you want to do that by age, or do you want to do it by some other metric? It's an open question.
Well, if you think about like a NASCAR race, right? It's like they're optimized based on their function, and they got to be within this range, right? Not the paint job of the car or how old it was, but literally what the function is, right?
Right.
So I think that's interesting. And one other just last thought that sparked in my mind, that another potential outgrowth of this work on the narrative side might be, as we've all encountered before, there's a good, half dozen or dozen common critiques people might have about even the endeavor of working on aging at all, or, oh, we're going to be bored, or, I don't want to see an immortal dictator, or this and that. And one of the ones that pops up is, you need things to turn over. You can't have politicians too long. You can't, science progresses one funeral at a time, etc. that old adage, right? So it would be really interesting, as if part of this work, if we can show that neuroplasticity, if people get proper interventions at some point, that, an 80-year-old can have the neuroplasticity of a 20-year-old. And then aside from just the biology, that could also work to say, hey, maybe the reason why you think of that, gerontocracy problem is because the reason why things get static is not because the person is 80 years old, but because literally their cognitive abilities have calcified, where therapies will maybe help that. And therefore that's not
Well, if you're worried about, immortalizing somebody in the legislature, that's fewer than 600 people in this country. There's still 330 plus million that we are interested in. And those 330 million are influential for those 600 and vice versa.
Yeah.
So, it's personalized medicine is a goal, and we have in mind the larger population.
Of course. Yeah. And if you think about it too, whatever cognitive decline happens to the average human being, right? If we were able to solve that problem, what effective altruism benefit would that be for like all of humanity if literally every person on the planet's cognitive abilities in the last 10 years of their life were much higher functioning?
That, as well as on the microscopic level, the person who's cognitively impaired and the family dealing with that person all have an influence. I'm more capable of thinking in those terms than in the larger societal issues that you've raised. That's the joy of being a bureaucrat. I can't think about that. Not my pay grade.
We all have the roles that hopefully interoperate in a nice, beneficial way. And, although I think we've had a rough couple of years globally, I'm optimistic that the next decade or so can be bright if we can all come together and get some of this work through the finish line. And you are a key part of that, Ron. So I just want to say thank you for all the work that you do.
Well, you're welcome. And I just want to return the compliment. I think that the things that you're doing with the LEAF are really important. Public perception of the advances that are made in science and in pharmaceutical and medicine those perceptions are not influenced so much by the scientists as they are by the advocacy groups. So thank you for what you do.
See what we can do in the next couple of years.
Yes,
And
we
I
will.
appreciate that sentiment, Ron. And okay, thank you for another great discussion, Ron, and for taking the time to join us once again at Ending Age-Related Diseases 2022. I hope you stay healthy and safe, and I hope we get to speak again soon.
Looking forward to it.